Gas Station Scare, submitted by Mike Hunt. When I was in my mid-20s, I worked overnights at a gas station on a highway in Pennsylvania. We were one of the only ones in the area that was open 24 hours, as most of the local joints shut down between 10 and 11 p.m. The closest business to us was a porn shop, and if you're familiar with Pennsylvania, you know that the highways are littered with those places. I'm not really sure what their hours were. I never had to call on them, but almost did when this happened. They were really the only other thing out there. Thank goodness I didn't have to. That would have been embarrassing. It was a pretty easy job, and most of the customers were usually just travelers or truckers pulling in, maybe grabbing a quick snack and then just taking off. The folks during the day had a much tougher job, as there were way more people coming in and also wanting food off of our grill, which we shut down at 10, which was an hour before I came into work. I worked 11 to 8, 6 days a week. One night in July, I was just doing my thing, reading a book and turning on and off the gas pumps for those who needed fuel, and then maybe cashing out the few people who came in to buy soda or salty snacks or coffee. Well, this really cute woman pulled up in an old green Chevy Impala and went to one of the farthest pumps away from the store. She then came in and asked me to help her with her car. She said there was some funny noise coming from the engine and she didn't know what it was. I politely told her that I couldn't really help her as, number one, I wasn't a mechanic and was not mechanically inclined at all, and two, I was not allowed to leave the store for any reason other than to sweep up the front walk when no one was there. She begged me again to help her, and I told her again, I'm really sorry, I can't help you. She went back to the car and popped the hood, and then went in front of it looking around for whatever she said was making a funny sound. I was looking through the glass at her when she turned and stared at me, and then came stomping back into the store. She said, I really need your help. Please come out here and take a look at this. I've got nowhere else to go, and I don't know if I'm going to make it to my destination. Once again, I told her I couldn't help her, but I offered her a phone book and the store phone to call a mechanic and see what they could help her with. She stood glaring at me for another minute and then stomped back off to her car. Again, she went under the hood for a few minutes before looking up and raising her arms at me in a, hey, what the hell, could you please just come out here gesture. I calmly shook my head and raised my hands in the, hey, I can't help you gesture. She finally just went over to the pump and stood there waiting for me to turn it on. I saw what she was doing, flipped the switch, and she started to fuel the car. That's when a guy wearing a ski mask got out of the back seat of the car and walked right over to the glass of the store where I was standing. He had a pair of brass knuckles in one hand and a big knife in the other. He put both of them up against the glass and stared at me before turning around, got behind the wheel of the car while the female got on the passenger side, and they took off. I locked the door and called my boss and told him what had happened, and he just said to leave the door locked and to just turn pumps on if people needed gas. He told me to not open the door for any reason. I told him I wasn't really cool with that and needed someone to come in and hang out with me for the rest of the night, which in turn made him call me a pussy and told me to man up. I'm not a small guy, and back then I was really into jiu-jitsu and working out, but I was still freaked out that some dude with a knife and brass knuckles just threatened me, and my boss wasn't going to do anything about it. Finally, I just said, okay, asshole, and hung up the phone on my boss. He came in the next morning at 5:30 and was really mad at me. I looked at him and said, you know what? Fuck this job and fuck you. I walked out, but not before telling him I would be back in 2 days for my last paycheck. I was done with that job. The next day, it was on the TV news from the biggest city over from us. A guy in a 7-Eleven had been lured from his post by an attractive female, then jumped by a guy in a ski mask and was thrown into the trunk of a car. He was beaten, the store was robbed, and as politely as I could say this, the poor guy was violated from behind by the guy in the ski mask. They tied him up with zip ties and left him behind a dumpster in a shopping plaza 25 miles from his store. When I went for my last paycheck, I told my boss about it and said, hey, dick, that's what I was talking about. He didn't say anything. He just handed me my paycheck and I left. I never went back there, but I always think about what could have happened. elementary friend was Psychotic by Tony Tonix. I remember 5th grade like it was yesterday. It was my first year in public school, and I was absolutely wrecked about it. I lived in Missouri for my entire life before then, but my parents had gotten a job offer in Nebraska. So here I was, at this new little elementary school that I was going to attend in my tiny subdivision. The vice principal at the time was giving me and my parents a tour of the building, and I remember that tour so vividly. I was wearing a purple coat that I was growing out of. It had pink and white stars on it. My parents were talking to the vice principal throughout the entire trip. The only time I remember really paying attention is when we stopped in front of a small corner-nestled classroom. There was a small plaque on the wall that read, 5th grade, Ms. Robertson. The door was opened by the vice principal, and my family and I stepped in. Every judgmental 11-year-old eye in the room turned from the board to the door. My mom nearly pushed me in as Ms. Robertson gave a welcoming smile to me. "Kids, this is our new student. Say hi." As everyone was giving their greetings, I remember one girl in particular getting up from her seat. She was one of the closest desks to the door. Ms. Robertson said something along the lines of, "No, Ella," before 2 thin arms were wrapped around my midsection. I didn't know what was going on for a good few seconds, but as soon as the mortified teacher started to apologize, I hugged back. "All right, Ella," Miss Robertson remarked. "You can sit back down." The girl, Ella, sat back down at her desk as the vice principal mumbled something to my parents. The next thing I knew, I was being taken from the room by a hand on my shoulder. The door closed behind us. The rest of the tour was short, but a blur. When I was safely buckled into my seat in the car, my dad started driving again, and my mother turned to face me. "That little girl that hugged you, her name is Ella, right?" I wasn't given a chance to answer. "She's obviously a special student, and I think she might have Asperger's. Be nice to her, okay?" I nodded proudly, as I didn't see anything wrong at all. I was weird. She was weird, and I was a definite extrovert. Ella and I were going to be best friends. On my first day of school, I sat next to Ella. Ella was a normal girl like everyone else. Sure, she was a bit talkative, and personal space wasn't really her forte, but she was sweet. It bothered me that I was the only one who seemed to see it that way. By the middle of the next week, it became blatantly clear that Ella was, in fact, not as normal as I made her out to be. She was quite clingy, for one thing, and was also really weird towards Max, a boy in our class who was on the more popular end of the spectrum. Ella was obsessed with Max, on a creepy, mildly insanely level of infatuation. Max avoided the deranged girl's feats of affection, and it seemed, though, as if Ella couldn't help but stay latched onto the boy's arm like a leech. It was no secret that she had an extensive crush on Max. Besides the thing with Max, Ella got weirder and weirder. It seemed as if she didn't want me to look at anyone else. I could understand that, though, as Ella didn't have any other friends. It got bad when I started to become increasingly popular amongst other classmates. I was the new girl, and everyone wanted to be my friend. Plus, I couldn't help being nice and inclusive to everyone. I became close to a group of kids who were usually all together. Anika, Seth, and Violet were like the 3 musketeers. They were an odd bunch, but everyone seemed to adore them, like some sort of dream team. I played with them at recess, and Ella didn't seem to like that. I didn't know what happened, but before I knew it, the dream team was avoiding me. I was out. Aiden was another story, a story that I could read all day, the kind of story with a beautiful laminated cover and the most elegant poetry written known to man. I had the biggest crush on him. Aiden and I became friends, but knowing how Ella felt about other friends, I kept the whole thing hush-hush. I think after I started hanging out with Aiden was really the time I recognized that I didn't like Ella. I didn't like her at all. I began to distance myself little by little from Ella, but to my surprise, she didn't seem to notice. I began to play with Aiden at free time, sitting on top of the hill behind the playground. We would sit right at the top, behind a rabbit tree, so it was harder for Ella to find us. That tree was where I confessed my crush to Aiden, and where he confessed back. Behind that tree was the first place that I had ever held hands with a boy. Everything went downhill fast. It was like some part of a cliché horror movie. I started to get notes on my locker asking where I was, saying, "I'll find you at recess." And there were murder threats written in thick black ink saying, "I will slit your throat." I stayed inside during recess and threw up. I was shaking and crying, and I didn't know what to do. Seth caught me as the class came back from recess. "Ella told us she was going to murder us if we keep stealing you from her." The things I heard about Ella only got worse. She followed Max home and took pictures of him. She put a spider in Damien's backpack. Eventually, word got around to the teacher and Ella was suspended. Aiden and I started dating, officially, and we could hang out at recess on the playground worry-free. The dreaded day when Ella returned, I told her that I wasn't afraid of her and that I didn't want to be friends anymore. I told her that if I wasn't going to hang out with her, and if that she threatened my friends, I would make sure that everyone knew how crazy she was. The notes on my locker stopped, and everything seemed to be over. Until the next day. As soon as school ended, I walked home on the route I usually took. I don't remember why, but I got this eerie feeling in my stomach, and I whipped my head around in panic. There stood Ella, maybe 10 paces behind me. As soon as she saw that I had spotted her, she sped up. I had no desire to die at that point, and I booked it across the sidewalk, sprinting for dear life. I don't remember screaming or anything. I might have, in fact. I probably did, but I have no recollection. I could hear Ella behind me, and I became paranoid that she was catching up. I dropped my backpack and sprinted all the way home, not even looking back when I closed the door behind me. I told my parents what happened, and they assured me that I was okay. Ella was expelled from Canebrook Elementary, and I never saw her again. 4.5 years later, I still keep in contact with Aiden and Seth, who is now Sasha. But I still have nightmares, sometimes about Ella slitting my throat, just like she promised. So, psycho girl from 5th grade, let's never meet again. Bear Attack by Todd O. This past October, I took an early morning hike in the Madison Valley of southwest Montana. Knowing that bears are common throughout the area and not wanting to surprise one, I hollered out, "Hey, bear!" every 30 seconds or so. About 3 miles in, I stepped out into a meadow and hollered again. A few more steps, and I spotted a grizzly bear with her cubs on the trail at the upper end of the meadow. The sow saw me right away, and they all ran up the trail. But then she stopped, turned, and charged straight for me. I yelled so she would know I was human and hopefully turn back. No such luck. I gave her a full charge of bear spray at about 25 feet. Her momentum carried her right through the orange mist and on to me. I dived face first into the dirt and wrapped my arms around the back of my neck for protection. She was on top of me, biting my arms, shoulders, and backpack. The force of each bite was like a sledgehammer with teeth. Over and over she bit me. After what felt like hours but was merely minutes, she disappeared. Stunned, I carefully picked myself up. I was able to walk, so I half hiked and half jogged back down the trail towards my truck, 3 miles below. I'd had numerous bleeding puncture wounds on my arms and shoulder, but I knew I would survive and thanked God for getting me through this. After about 5 or 10 minutes down the trail, I heard a sound and turned. It was the Grizz, bearing down 30 feet away. I was lucky after the first attack, but could I survive a second? Again, I protected the back of my neck with my arms and kept tight against the ground to protect my face and eyes. She slammed down on top of me and bit my shoulder and arms. My hand instantly went numb, and the wrists and fingers were limp and unusable. The sudden pain made me flinch and gasp for breath, and that sound triggered a frenzy of bites to my shoulder and upper back. I knew I couldn't move or make a sound again, so I huddled, motionless. Another couple bites to my head caused a gash to open above my eye, nearly scalping me. The blood gushed over my face and into my eyes. I didn't move. I thought this was the end. She would eventually hit an artery in my neck, and I would bleed out on the trail. But suddenly she stopped, There was dead silence except for the sound of her heavy breathing and sniffing. I could feel her breath on the back of my neck and her front claws digging into my lower back below my pack where she stood. I could smell the terrible pungent odor she emitted. For 30 seconds, she stood there crushing me, my chest smashed into the ground, my forehead in the dirt. And then, she was gone. I tried to peek out, but my eyes were full of blood and I couldn't see. I knew that if she came back a third time, I'd be dead, so I wiped the blood from one eye and looked around. No bear. I stood up and moved quickly down the trail again. 45 minutes later, I got into my truck and drove 17 miles to the hospital. Most punctures and tears were on my arms and shoulder, but a 5-inch gash along the side of my head left a nasty scar. The next day, I woke up with dark bruising in the shape of claws across my lower back where the bear had stood on me. Not my best day, but I'm alive. My Paranormal Experiences, submitted by Abigail H. My name is Abigail, and I've been a fan of your podcast for a pretty long time now. I've been thinking recently that I have some pretty interesting stories from when I was young and still lived in my childhood home, and I thought that you would find intriguing. I'll start off with this one. When I was very little, maybe 2 or 3, I was very close to my paternal grandmother, Grandma McCarley. Now, I vaguely remember our time together, but I know of our strong bond from all the stories my family has told me about her. She thought I was her child and loved me with my mother's love. She would always watch me closely and enjoyed all of our moments together. At the time I came into her life, she was already 95 years old, so a short 3.5 years later, she passed away. As I was very young, my mother didn't know how to break the hard news to me. She didn't think I could ever understand or know how to deal with such a great loss at that young age. But little did she know, there would be no need to. The night of my grandmother's death, while I don't remember much, I do vividly remember late at night being woken up by the door to my tiny little bedroom creaking open, and in stepping this woman, who I didn't really recognize then, but I now know to be a much younger version of my Grandma McCarley. I remember this overwhelming feeling of calmness and safeness as she sat down on the edge of my bed and looked at me for a moment before gently telling me that Grandma McCarley had fallen asleep and that she's not going to wake up this time. I remember understanding and accepting that my beloved grandmother was okay and everything was fine. After being told this, I quickly fell back to sleep, and that is where my memory of this event ends, but my mother has filled me in on the rest. The next morning when I woke up, I went into the kitchen where my mother was fixing my breakfast and wondering how to tell me the news of the death. I promptly said, "Mommy, Grandma McCarley went to sleep and she's not going to wake up this time." My mother said that she just stared at me in shock, wondering how I knew this information. She told me that I was right and that it was going to be okay. I only responded with, "I know," and I gave her a smile. A few days later, a series of events happened that still never failed to give me chills. Again, I have no memory of this, but I have been filled in on the details. When my mother was loading me into the car a few days later, I sat bolt upright and started enthusiastically pointing at a spot in the garage and saying, "Look, Mommy, look, it's Grandma McCarley and the man with dirt on his head." My mother turned around frantically trying to see what I was inevitably seeing, but she saw nothing. I was trying to get out of my seat and go to my grandma, but my mother got in the car and drove away quickly as she was starting to get creeped out. As we were slowly cruising down through the neighborhood, she heard my little voice pipe up again. "Mommy, Mommy, look, it's Grandma McCarley and the man with dirt on his head." This time, my mother tried asking me where I saw her and who the man with dirt on his head was. I just looked at her but didn't provide an answer. Throughout the next week or two, I would point out Grandma McCarley and the man with dirt on his head in random locations throughout my hometown. To this day, I think she loved me so much, she decided she had come back from the afterlife to visit me. All I'm wondering now is who the man with dirt on his head was. The next 2 stories also take place at my childhood home. I grew up in a town that used to be a very prominent area of Cherokee Indians. I didn't know this until recently, but my old childhood home was very near an Indian burial ground, which I believe to be a very important factor in this story. When I was little, I remember me and my sister's playroom residing in the basement. This basement was partially underground and had a set of double doors that opened to the outside on one of the walls. My mother would often stick us down there to play all day while she did some chores around the house to get a break from the little wild kids that we were. At the time I was around 5 and my sister was 4. We both had very vivid memories of these events. One of my earliest memories of having a friend is one of this dirty little girl named Diane. I'm not sure how to spell her name, but that's how it sounds. She would only come to see me and my sister while it was just us playing in the basement. She would always just sort of show up in the back corner of the basement when we wouldn't expect it, but hey, we were little kids. We didn't see anything wrong or question how she got in. I never even had a second thought. To me, she was just another little girl that I could play with. Here are some things I remember about Diane. She had brown skin and short black hair. She hardly ever spoke. She was always very dirty. I don't remember much about her clothing, just that it was dirty, and it struck me as odd even back then, but being the nice little kid I was, I never said anything to her about it. She would always play with us for about an hour, and then she would just suddenly stand up and walk out the doors. We always had so much fun with her except for when she got mad. She didn't get mad very often, but the things that she would get mad about were very random. I remember there was a whole pile of toys that my sister and I wouldn't touch because Diane had claimed them. In these instances, if we tried to touch them, she wouldn't speak to us. She would just give us a look with her deep brown eyes, and somehow we knew not to cross her. She would also communicate with us what she wanted us to do without speaking. More often than not, the things she wanted us to do were mischievous and naughty. She wanted us to tear up our toys at times, and other times it was to draw on the walls. Once, she told us to get into the supplies for the washing machine, which were down there because the basement also served as our laundry room. My mother always just laughed when we told her Diane told us to do it, as she just played it off as an imaginary friend at the time. Not too many months after I remember starting to see Diane, I turned 6 and was whisked off to kindergarten. I was so excited because I knew that since Diane was my age, she would be in my kindergarten class. But to my surprise, she was nowhere to be seen. I was sad that she wasn't there and asked my mom why Diane wasn't at school. She didn't seem to know who it was. After that day, I never saw Diane again, and only just recently did I bring up Diane with my mother and sister. My sister vividly remembers her exactly the same way I did, and now that we're much older, we managed to thoroughly creep my mother out. I don't know who or what Diane actually was, but to this day, I suspect that she may have been a lonely little Native American spirit looking for some children of her own age to play with. I will always remember her as my first best friend. This last story is short, but one that I find interesting. My father and uncle were working on building the back porch for my old house when we first moved into it. I was very little, but I've been told this story countless times. The porch that they were building had some very tall and very heavy beams that had to be held up and nailed into the ground. When I say tall and heavy, I mean if they fell on top of somebody, they would be crushed. Well, my uncle was given the task of holding up the beam while my father anchored it into the ground. My father had forgotten some type of tool on the other side of the house and left my uncle holding the pole, asking him many times if he could handle holding the thing up on his own. My uncle assured him that it would be okay, but to hurry back, as it was heavy. After about a minute of holding up the pole, my uncle felt his strength starting to wane, and the pole had started to slowly tilt right over in his direction. In those moments, he was sure that he was going to die. He thought that was the end, but right when it really started to slip past the point of no return, he felt a pair of strong hands on his back pushing him back up to a point where he could safely hold the beam up. He sighed aloud and said, "Thanks, man," thinking it was my father who had pushed him back up. But right after the words left his mouth, my father came around the corner of the house lugging the tool he had previously forgotten. There is no way he could have pushed my uncle back up from all the way across the yard. To this day, we don't know what pushed my uncle back up to safety, but personally, I believe that it was his guardian angel looking out for him in his most dire time of need. Band on the Run, submitted by Brutal454. When I was in college, I joined up with a couple of guys to form a 5-piece band to write some originals and do some covers, the latest alternative tunes. This was back in the late 90s. We played on our college campus frequently, as well as some of the local bars, and people seemed to like our sound. We'd made friends with a local band that had been established for quite some time and opened up for them at a number of gigs. One night after such a show, the lead singer and I were having a beer and just talking before we were going to load up our gear to head out for the night. He said they were planning on a tour of the south part of our state and the northern part of the adjoining state. I'll just say it was North Carolina and South Carolina. It was going to only be like 10 shows, but it would be in the span of a week and a half lined up with our spring break. So I asked the fellas what they thought and if they were interested, as we had no gigs booked and none of us were going anywhere other than home for spring break. They all asked about money, and the lead singer was honest and said it would not be a ton of cash, but it would be good exposure and, hey, a fun time. I was all in, and eventually my bandmates came around too. We had nothing else going on anyway. So in order to get all of our stuff together, I convinced my mom to rent us a 10-passenger van. We could fit everyone in there and some of our stuff, and it also had a trailer hitch for a small trailer that we used to haul around the heavier gear that we had. Without going into too much detail, the first half of the trip was fun. There weren't tons of people at the shows, but it did give us a chance to work on some new material that our bass player and singer had come up with, and it was fun to just get our name out there and see if we might be invited back, or maybe could make a go of our band in a serious way on our own sometime. The second to last show was in a town I'm not going to name. The bar that we played at is no longer there, or it's named something else. The gig was fine, and we played our set and were settling in to listen to our friends after loading out our stuff. Our drummer wasn't feeling well and said he was just going to crash in the van until we were ready to move on, and then he went down to a convenience store a few blocks away to get some Pepto-Bismol. After the show, we were all hanging out playing pool and just having a couple of more beers before calling it a day. The last show was the next night, and then we had to drive home. As I was sitting at the bar, I looked out the front window and saw the lead singer of the other band in a heated argument with two guys. It looked like punches were going to be thrown, so I told the bouncer what was going on, and a bunch of us went outside to break it up. The two guys were yelling all kinds of threats to the lead singer, but they finally left. Of course, we all asked him what the hell was that about, and he just mumbled something about owing one of them $50 from the last time the band was playing here, but he didn't say anything else about it. Everyone went back inside and had a couple of more cold ones to just get back to a more relaxed tone. About a half hour later, someone came running in and asked who owned the white passenger van out back. The guy was kind of frantic and asked to use the phone to call the fire department. We immediately ran outside through the back entrance to see a fire underneath our van. It wasn't a huge fire, but it was placed in a way that it could have gotten bigger a lot faster. Plus, our drummer was inside deep asleep trying to get over his illness. Of course, the first thing we did was to get him out of the vehicle and kick the fire away from the bottom of the van as best we could. The bar owner came out with a fire extinguisher and did a great job of putting out the flames before the fire department showed up. Our drummer was fine, and there was very little damage to the van. Thank God this guy happened to notice it and run in immediately. We thanked him, and I had a report made out for the rental agency. Good thing we had insurance. So at that point, we decided to get out of Dodge right then and there after getting clearance from the fire department and the police. We got our money from the bar owner and took off. We didn't wait for our friend's band. We just met up with them later. Sometimes we did sleep in the van because it was cheaper to do so, but that night we decided to get a cheap-ass motel room and have everyone crowd in there. The cool thing about being young and in a band like that, we did also crash at some people's houses who liked what we played and found out while we really didn't have any accommodations, they would let us do that. Anyway, we played the last gig and made our way home. It wasn't long after that the other band broke up, and a couple of months later I found out a bunch of stuff that was disturbing. Their lead guitar player and I had bumped into each other at a music store, and I asked him what was up, and he said he was working on solo stuff and really kind of taking a break from the music scene as far as a band went. He then apologized for what happened to our van and what might have happened to our drummer, and I asked him what he meant. Well, What happened was the two guys that the lead singer had been fighting with had gone around back thinking that our van was their van and tried to set it on fire. He didn't owe him $50. He had knocked up one of the guy's sisters and then took off on her. Why he thought it was a good idea to come back to the same town, I have no idea. But he also had a pretty good coke habit that was screwing up the band, and that's why they decided to fold. I couldn't believe it. My friend could have gotten killed because of this idiot and his bullshit. At the time, we were just happy to get out of there, but when I told the rest of the guys what had happened, it all sank in pretty fast at how scary that really was. We could have been in some serious trouble, and our drummer might have lost his life. We all grew up and went our separate ways after playing together for another 2 years, but we all still talk all the time. Some of us have our own new bands, and I'm a music teacher at a local music store. When my students ask about starting bands and look for advice, the first thing that I tell them is to be sure you have a good idea who you're getting involved with before anything else. It might just save your life. My Unlikely Stalker by Phil Witt. So the reason I would call this unlikely is because I'm a 6'7", 260-pound teenager. So, frankly, I don't consider myself a likely victim to any manner of violent stranger. Anyway, because of my physical stature, I tend to be pretty flippant with doing stuff at night. But, looking back on this, I will admit shoveling after the sun goes down with headphones in is an altogether terrible idea. It started 3 years ago when I was walking home from my friend's house after a get-together, about a mile away from mine. It was about 11 p.m. and not many people were out. I was walking about 35 feet behind someone, and I wasn't really paying attention to him until he quickly turned and took a couple of steps up my front stairs. And that's when he used his phone to take a photo of my house, for some reason I assume on accident, with flash. He turned enough that I could see the details of his face pretty clearly. Needless to say, I hurried inside and counted the seconds until the sun came up. I had almost forgotten about that weird occurrence when, a week later, I was just finishing clearing my bottom steps. I have 2 sets of stairs leading from the sidewalk to my house, one pretty much on the sidewalk, then a 15-foot walkway, then steps up to my porch. This will be somewhat important later. I can't exactly recall what time it was, but it was dark and no one was around. This man seemingly comes out of nowhere and grabs my shoulder rather assertively, kind of startling me, but I didn't really get frightened. I had that feeling where you recognize someone, but you can't place where their face is from. Anyway, he said in a very bouncy tone, I have really no other way to describe it, "Hey, got a cigarette?" I said no, and he just walked off. To keep this story not super long, I'll summarize the next year's experience somewhat concisely. The same man came up to me while I was shoveling, still at night, and asked me the same question in the exact same tone of voice. I had the same response, and he left. This time, however, I knew where I had seen him before, and it began to creep me out, but I still wasn't freaked out entirely. Also, yes, this happened the next year, the next winter, and I had not seen this man the entire year between the first and second meeting. 6 months ago. So I figured based on the pattern, I would only see this man during the winter, and he really posed no threat. Once again, big guy arrogance. But this experience was the bit that really rocked me. I happen to have insomnia. It's only relevant because this happened while I was up at 3 a.m. walking around. I happened to glance out my second-floor bedroom window, which faces the road. I actually did the classic cartoon double-take and had to walk back to the window to peer out. What I saw still sticks in my head every time I look out the window. The man was standing on the other side of the street, directly across from my house. He was just staring at my house and pacing, almost like he was waiting for something to happen. After a few seconds of watching him do this, I turned the light on in my room. His head bolted up to look me damn nearly directly in the eye, and he quickly turned and walked down the road. That winter, shoveling had me extremely frightened. I never shoveled at night, and found myself literally jumping at slight noises behind me. At one point, I dropped my shovel multiple times shoveling my front walk, simply from fearful turns over my shoulder. I'm sure this looked hilarious, honestly, but still, from my point of view, The fear was real. That's when we get to a couple of weeks ago. Where I live, during the winter, the sun goes down around 5, and for some reason my mom was adamant that I'd have to shovel right when I got back from work, 6:30ish, even though it was dark out. I complied, but made sure to not listen to music and be very vigilant. Multiple times, I spun around to look at a few weirded out college students walking home. I live right by a college, and I had assumed they were him. Now we get to the part where my front walk geometry gets kind of important. I was just finishing up the stairs closest to my house as he clamped down on my shoulder. I whipped my head around to look him in the eye, but strangely, he wasn't startled and calmly said in his all-too-familiar phrase, "Hey, got a cigarette?" Once again, I said no. I'm not sure why I can't bring myself to say something else. He walked down my steps and continued on his way. My heart was racing as I rushed inside, and I haven't seen him since this experience, and I figure I won't see him again unless I have another middle-of-the-night sighting, as I'm leaving for college before next winter. Needless to say, I'm glad I've hopefully seen the last of him, but I can't shake the feeling that I haven't. So if anyone could stomach actually hearing all that, just looking for advice on what to do if I should actually be worried. The main reason I'm concerned is because I have code locks, and I'm worried maybe if this man has seen the code, he could get into my house. I don't know. Am I overreacting? Our New House, submitted by Alex Jones Sucks. My wife and I moved to a suburb of Athens, Georgia in the summer of 2014. I had recently gotten a job and we moved from Tallahassee, Florida, and we were excited to purchase our first home. It wasn't anything special, but it wasn't any piece of garbage either. It was in a really nice neighborhood with a deep backyard that butted up to some forest. We were really happy with it and were really excited to move in, and the best part was, it was fairly new and we didn't have to do a lot of work to it like a lot of my friends did with the places they had bought. We didn't have any children at the time, so unpacking really wasn't that hard. It did take us a couple of days, of course, but I'm the kind of person that needs to get things done. I don't like to have a cluttered home, so I made a point to work my ass off to get all of the things taken care of and arranged for the boxes to go back to the U-Haul place. They were mostly in good shape and they bought them back. My wife helped out like a trooper, as she is really a stud. Yeah, I'm using that word with a female. She is nothing short of amazing. Totally fit, totally gorgeous, love her to death. I met her in a triathlon club that we were in, and we never looked back after our first meeting. After 3 days of unpacking and arranging and all the sort of things that you have to do with a new home, we decided to relax in the backyard with a couple of drinks. A couple from next door came over and rapped on our fence and said, "Knock, knock." The woman of the couple held up a bottle of wine and 4 glasses, and the guy held up a 6-pack of Terrapin beer. They introduced themselves as Rick and Jean, and we immediately became close friends right off the bat. We all hung out in my backyard having drinks and getting to know each other, and I was asking lots of questions about the neighborhood and that sort of thing. They were both our age and on the same track as us. My wife was an account executive for an ad agency, and I was working as a professor at a local university. Rick was a graphic designer by trade, and his wife was a school teacher, so we actually had a lot in common, and it made conversation easy. When I asked about the neighborhood and the rest of the folks that lived in it, Rick said it was really safe, but one thing that he did recommend if we didn't already have one was a security system. He said it wasn't completely necessary, but because it was a fairly upscale neighborhood, from time to time there were break-ins, or at least attempted break-ins. My wife's name is Stephanie, and she and I actually talked about this after her car had been broken into when it was parked in our garage at our apartment building back in Tallahassee. I agreed with Rick and asked what brand he had. He said he had gotten his from a local company, had them install it, and he really liked its features. And this was before those doorbells that you can install that had the cameras, and the affordable cameras you can have all around the outside of your house. I will say this, we still live in that house, and I do have a system like that now. So as the night ended, we all said goodbye and made plans to get together again later that week for dinner after work, and my wife and I went back inside. I asked her if we should get right on the security system, and she said just do some research, find out exactly what we need, and if the place Rick and Jean went to really is that good. let's just get it done. I did my research, and they were an affordable company that had great products and free installation with a certain level of the system that you bought. It provided for windows, doors, and it was fairly new on the market with remote controls for everything. It would alert you on your phone if something was wrong. I made an appointment for the installer to come out and get everything set up, and luckily did not have to go into work that day, so I could just bum around the house and have the guy do what he needed to do. His name was Matt, and he seemed pretty cool. I remember he had a Fender ball cap, and I asked him if he played guitar. He said he did, and he obviously knew that I did during his installation, as I had one of our spare bedrooms set up as my little space for my instruments. I'm a guitar freak, and had all of my acoustics and electrics stored in there or on display in their cabinets. So this guy Matt is doing his thing, and I'm just looking at some stuff I have to prepare for school starting fairly soon. We had moved early to make sure that we had a jump on our careers, and not really necessary for Stephanie, but very necessary for me. Matt was going in and out of the house with his gear and was done fairly quickly. I thought, wow, this guy's really efficient. It only took him about 3 hours to have the entire house wired with the system, and for the next hour he walked me through how to set it up, how to turn it on and off, and all that kind of stuff. When he was done, I thanked him, we shook hands, and I gave him an extra $50 tip. He said thanks. In retrospect, I wish I had that $50 back. When Stephanie got home from work, I showed her how the system worked, and she was really happy that we had bought it. Just another peace of mind for new homeowners, I thought. The next night we were out with Rick and Jean, and they took us to a local brewery, and then we went to a fabulous restaurant. I told Rick all about my new system that I had put in, and it turns out it was the exact same one he had. So far, so good. We went home, and Stephanie and I did what all young newlyweds do. Well, actually, we've been married for 3 years. A little roll in the hay, and you know what I mean. The next morning we woke up, and I was still feeling a little frisky, and well, you figure that out. That evening, Stephanie's phone buzzed. She picked it up and looked at the text message she had received. She kind of cocked her head in that, what the heck is this motion? I was sitting in my chair next to the sofa she was on, and I just said, "Hey, what's up, babe? Everything okay?" As much as I love her and her job, as an account executive, man, they bothered her all the time. She just looked at me and said, "I have a text that reads, 'You have a very nice body.'" I laughed and said, "Well, that's true," but the look on her face told me it wasn't funny. I got serious really fast and said, "Well, who's it from?" She said she didn't know. It was a number that she was not familiar with. I told her to read it to me and got out my phone. She read it aloud and then said, "Okay, I know you. Be easy on whoever this is. It could just be a wrong text." So before I did anything, I told her to just respond to it and say, "Who is this?" She said she'd already done that, but no one had responded. I said, "Okay, well, let's wait for a little bit then." About 5 minutes later, she got another text that said, "It doesn't matter who I am, but you do have a nice body." Stephanie texted back, "Seriously, who is this? Who are you trying to reach?" No response. We waited 10 minutes this time before I dialed the number and got a dead line. That whole, "You have reached a number that is no longer in service" message. So I decided to text the number and in a fun way said, "You have a very nice body." I got a response very fast that said, "Fuck off." I laughed out loud and said, "I don't understand this. The phone line says it's dead, but I just got a text back and it says fuck off." Stephanie laughed a little bit too, but then she got a text right then that said, "Tell your husband not to text me." Okay, that was not cool, and now I was not laughing. I was pissed. I told her to tell whoever it was that if they texted her again, I would find them and wrap their balls around the top of their head and stuff them in their mouth. She said she wasn't going to go that far, but did say, "Please stop texting me." The response came back saying, "Okay." Steph and I talked about it for a while before deciding to just let it go, but also agreed that if something else happened, we were going to call the phone company to figure out what the heck was going on. Maybe it was somebody just jerking around, But the fact that when I called it, it said the phone line was dead and we were still getting texts left us unsettled. I mean, this was long before I knew anything about being able to text via computer, if that's what it was. So, a few days passed, and there was nothing going on, and we were back to work doing what we had to do. I was home in my office just getting ready for school when Stephanie called me and she said, "I got another text, this time from a different number." Of course, I asked what it'd say, and she said this one's a little different. When she told me, I immediately told her I was calling the phone company. This one described what she was wearing as she got dressed that morning before she left for work. Stephanie has a habit of walking around in the bathroom in our bedroom naked, which I love, but this text message was really creepy. At first I thought maybe we had a peeping Tom that was looking in the windows, but there was nothing but the forest behind our house, and that's where our windows faced. I told her to make a note of the number and told her I would call the phone company immediately. I did, but they were not very helpful. I was getting angrier and angrier the longer I stayed on the phone, and I think anybody who's had to deal with a phone company has the same feelings. They kept saying they really didn't know what to do, as the number was not assigned to their carrier. I asked if they knew what carrier it was assigned to, and they said it was impossible for them to know. I often wonder if that was just a bullshit line to get me off the phone. So, angrily, I decided to go out into the backyard following up on my peeping Tom theory. I looked into the trees to see if there was any way anyone could climb up into them to get a look into our house, and I didn't see anything. But, like a dork, I went from tree to tree looking for any telltale signs of someone climbing up in them. In my mind, I had this whole elaborate climbing system bouncing around, like those spikes people have in telephone poles, or the spikes linemen use to get up and down trees and the like. There was no evidence of anything like that, and I was sure that we did not have a peeping Tom in the trees behind the house. I texted Steph what the company had said and what I had looked at in the backyard, but before I even needed to tell her, she had already blocked the number and just went on with her day. That weekend, we were over at Rick and Jean's house hanging out in their backyard, and we were telling them about the weird text that we had gotten. We couldn't figure it out. Rick told me that he had a brother that worked for a telecom company and he would see if there was anything else we could do as far as figuring out where these messages were coming from, but that ended up being fruitless. Even so, I told him that I appreciated his help. We dropped the subject and then just hung out and played cards. Nothing happened for about a week, but then while Steph and I were sitting having dinner, her phone buzzed, she picked it up, and dropped it onto the table. I immediately reached over and grabbed it and looked down. It was a picture of Stephanie on top of me in bed. Now I was freaking out. This was not cool. This was also a new number. I texted back furiously and said, "Knock it off. Just cut it out." It wasn't threatening. I wasn't being a jerk. I was just telling whoever it was to knock it off. The response came back, "What are you going to do about it, tough guy?" Then came another picture of Stephanie lying back on the bed by herself, just stretching out like she usually did before a workout. That's when I noticed right away that the angle the picture was taken was the same as all of the other ones. I responded again, "Seriously, I don't know who you are, but I'm being cool, just telling you to stop." The text came back, "Ha ha ha," and showed a picture of me doing something to Stephanie that I don't really need to describe here. Now I lost my shit. I told Steph she was getting a new phone and a new line the next day, and I didn't care how much it cost us. I also called the police and said we were getting harassing pictures from what looked like someone taking pictures from inside our house, and we didn't understand how that was possible. They said they'd send somebody out the next day, as they said there was no imminent danger or threat. I just rolled my eyes and said, "Okay." I told them I'd be there. And the next day, I gave Stephanie my phone and was going to go to the store to swap out hers. When the officer came over, he asked me what was going on, and I showed him some of the pictures, even the compromising ones, and I said I can't for the life of me figure out what's going on. He asked to see our bedroom, and I said sure. I took him upstairs, and he looked all around the room and tried to get into the same position as where the photographs had been taken. Nothing was askance in our room, and nothing that I could see or he could see, and believe you me, The night before, I had looked all over that room trying to figure out where this person was getting these pictures. The officer made notes of everything and said to keep him abreast of anything else that happened, and then he gave me his card. He said there wasn't much he could do at that point, but if this stuff kept up, he would have a forensics team out to take a look and see what was going on. Gee, thanks. About an hour later, Stephanie's phone buzzed, and it was her, calling me. I picked up, and she said that she had just gotten a text on my phone that said, "Why do you have your husband's phone?" Now I was not only angry, I was kind of scared. This was getting more fucked up as every minute went by. I asked her if she could get out of work early, and she could, so she came home and we immediately went to the phone place to change our phones. It took a while, but we felt a little better that we had new numbers, even though that would be a giant pain in the ass to have to change over all of our contacts with our friends and family. It was going to be a lot of phone calls and texts and emails to get back to where we were. But I didn't care. I didn't want any more texts coming in at all. I had saved all of the pictures online, so just in case anything else was needed, I would have copies. Everything was quiet for a month. Teaching was now in full swing for me, and we were slowly forgetting about all that creepiness. But that's when this happened. I received a thumb drive in my school mail in a plain yellow envelope. There was only another piece of paper in the envelope, and I wondered what the heck was going on, and maybe, gee, I can't plug this thing in because maybe there's a virus on it. But curiosity got the best of me after I looked at a paper that said, "I could have texted you at your new numbers, but this file was too big. Ha ha ha." So I plugged the thumb drive into my computer, and there was a very long AVI file of me and my wife in various stages of undress, and both of us having sex. This was the end of the line for me. I made arrangements to leave work after talking to my department chair and explaining what was going on. I canceled my afternoon classes, called Stephanie, and went straight to the police. I turned over everything that we had to them, and they assigned a detective and a forensics team to our case. Steph and I were distraught and didn't even feel like going into our home after we met with the authorities. But we did, and just decided to avoid our bedroom until an investigation was done. The detective and his team appreciated that we were going to leave that area alone so that they could go to work without having any disturbance. The next day, they came in a team of 6. They had all kinds of equipment I had never seen before, and within 20 minutes found what was going on, at least at our house. A camera had been installed in our digital thermostat. I'd never even noticed it was not the same thermostat that was in the rest of the house. I mean, seriously, how many times do you really look at something like that? The first person I thought of was Matt, the guy from the security store. Of course, the police asked if anything had been installed, and I gave them all the information about the security place. I showed them the contract that I had signed. I told them all about the day the security system was installed, who Matt was, the whole 9 yards. They were there for the better part of the day going through the entire house to see if there was anything else out of the ordinary, but there wasn't. The only thing they found was that camera set up in our bedroom. Of course, they went to the security system company, and lots of things were revealed. Number 1, they didn't sell any apparatus like the fake thermostat with the camera in it. And number 2, lo and behold, installer Matt had quit 2 weeks earlier under a cloud. Basically, the guy just disappeared, never even collected his last paycheck. He was no longer at the address they had on record, and he had no permanent address to begin with. He basically just disappeared into the wind. The investigative team figured out that the camera worked on a remote control basis. It wasn't on all the time. It was only on when it was told to be on, so that meant the person operating it had to have been near our home and known that we were there. That made this entire ordeal even creepier. Whoever was operating the camera had to have been within a pretty close distance of our house to turn it on and off. All signs in my head pointed to this creep named Matt, but, like I said, he was gone. Even a check of his social security card and his other documents he had for his employment came up fake. At the end of the day, Stephanie and I just changed the thermostat out, changed our phones once again, and we never got any more creepy messages. No more videos being sent our way, no nothing. but it didn't take away the fact that we felt unbelievably violated. It's unbelievable to feel unsafe in your own home. This might sound a little overboard, but I did invest in a few handguns and a shotgun, and Stephanie and I go to the range twice a month without fail. When my kids are old enough, I'm going to teach them to shoot as well. Don't get me wrong, I don't think that I'm preparing for a zombie invasion, but this whole process has made me look at the world a little differently. We also went so far as to get an entire new security system installed with a different company, and zero problems with them. Rick and Jean also did the same after they knew all the things that we had been through. I wasn't going out of my way to screw the original company out of business, but when word got out that they were at the base of our issue, they went out of business pretty quick. I did feel kind of bad about that. I mean, the owner was really nice and actually opened up a different business in our town. It's doing well. I bumped into him a year ago, and he actually shook my hand and said, "Hey, no hard feelings. I wish I had been on top of things and knew who I was hiring." So, we thought all was well with the world. We're a very happy family, but there is a twist in this story, and the reason that I sent it to you, Uncle Josh. Last week, Steph got an anonymous text from someone we don't know, from a number that is not in service, that only said, "Well, it was fun while it lasted." We reported it, we blocked the number, and we're hoping that that's the last we will hear from whoever is sending those messages. Overnight in the Warehouse, submitted by Joe. For a couple of years, I worked in a warehouse for a shipping company. It wasn't in an industrial park and pretty much out of the way, just like most places like that are. I was the only person there from 11 to 4 and worked until 8 a.m. But at 4 a.m., 2 coworkers of mine came in to start their shift. It was a very large building with office space in front, glass doors, windows, that sort of thing. Back in the warehouse part, there was only one small set of windows on one side of the building, and a door with a window on the other side. Other than that, it was just mostly the big overhead doors where deliveries came and went. I was in charge of cleaning up the place, sweeping, mopping, that sort of stuff. Just a janitor, but at the time I liked the hours and it paid well. I usually started in the front offices, making sure wastebaskets were empty and the front customer service area was vacuumed, etc. So, the night that I'm talking about, I was doing my thing listening to my headphones, and that's when I noticed someone at the door of the office space. I looked up to see a pretty disheveled-looking guy standing there knocking on the glass. I took my headphones off and walked over to the door and said in a loud voice so he could hear me, "I'm sorry, the building's closed." He didn't say anything for a second, but then said,
"Can I use your phone? I have a problem with my car, and I don't have any way to call anyone to help me."
I told him that the building was closed and I couldn't let him in. That's sort of not true. I did have keys, and frankly, if he looked like he needed immediate medical attention, I probably would have let him in. But his story didn't make any sense to me. There was no reason for him to be driving a truck around and back in this area at that time of night. All of the other businesses closed way earlier in the day, or had people on staff like me. If he was visiting someone, he should have just been there. So I told him that if he walked to the edge of the business park, there was a gas station and a pizza shop that was probably open and they could get him help. Again, he stood silently, but then started banging his head softly on the door and said,
"Come on, man, you've got to help me. I just need to use your phone."
I shook my head and said, "I'm really sorry, I just can't help you, man." He then looked up and went into a rage, calling me all kinds of names and started pounding on the door. Thank God all of the glass on the doors and windows up front were very heavy-duty and reinforced. I knew there was no way he was going to be breaking through them, but it startled me so much that I jumped back. When I did my little hop, he just started laughing and punching the glass harder. I could see that he was messing up his hands as there were blood smears showing up on the glass. I mean, this guy was truly out of control. I told him if he didn't knock it off, I would call the police. If he just wanted to laugh and go on your way, I wouldn't do anything about it. I mean, who knows what his problem was? I was trying to be cool and not cause him any more issues. At that point, he finally stopped, pointed at me, and then turned to walk towards the parking lot, but not before trying to rip out some of the landscape shrubbery. I just shook my head and figured when the early crew came in, I would go out and clean up the doors for the regular business hours. I said a small prayer for the guy and hoped that he got whatever help he was looking for that night. I finished up the front and went into the back warehouse area and started on things there. I was working for maybe a half hour when I heard the back entrance doorbell ring, and there was a knock at the door. I looked at my watch, and it was 2:30, and I wondered if maybe one of my coworkers was coming in early and had forgotten his keys or access badge. I set my broom against the wall and went over to the door, and in the little window of the door, who did I see? The same guy from up front. This had to have been at least an hour later from when he was first there. I looked at him and saw that his face was now bloody, and he again yelled through the door that he needed to use the phone. It was like he didn't even recognize I was the same person he had been talking to earlier. For the third time, I told him I couldn't let him into the building, and then reiterated that the gas station and pizza place a mile away might be his best bet. Of course, same reaction. He started kicking at the door, but this time it being a steel door, I don't know what kind of satisfaction he was looking for by doing that. I told him, "Look, buddy, if you don't leave, I'm calling the police." He then turned away from the door, and I heard a loud bang on the glass and realized that he'd just picked up a rock or something outside and threw it at the window of the door. It didn't do much more than leave a small crack, but it startled me just like I had been startled before. This time around, I'd had enough. I went over to the phone on the wall and called the police. I described what the guy looked like, and they said they'd send a patrol car out to see what was going on and what needed to be sorted out. I told them that if they needed me to come to the back door, as that's where I was working. For the next 15 minutes, I heard pounding on all of the loading dock doors, and I could hear the guy outside yelling that he was going to kill me. I knew I was safe inside, but it was still pretty scary to hear all that stuff going on, knowing that I was all by myself. It took the police about a half hour to get out there, and when they did, they knocked on the back door and rang the bell. I opened it and let them in. They kind of stood there in the door, asking me questions about the guy and where he might have gone, and if I'd seen him around before, that sort of thing. The female police officer was scanning the back part of our loading dock area that butted up to thickly wooded green space. And suddenly she yelled out, "Hey, you, don't move!" And both of them took off running towards the woods. I could hear more yelling as they both ran into the trees, but couldn't see what was going on. After a few minutes, I suddenly heard a guy screaming after I heard something muffled from one of the cops. They had found him hiding and eventually tased his ass. They dragged him out of the woods and asked me if this was the guy. I said, "Yeah, that's him." And the police officers called for an ambulance, and soon their captain or lieutenant or whatever came out, and I don't know how that works. They went and took pictures of the front door, and I think they tried to get some kind of blood sample, but again, I don't know how any of that works, and I figured that the blood from being on there had dried after being there so long. I didn't really see that purpose. I clearly had ID'd the guy. His hands were bloody, and there was no question that it was him who did that. Turns out, he was a local junkie and just strung out on whatever it was that he took. He'd been wandering around town all day completely wasted and got lost when he came into the business park. I think it's quite possible that he had good intentions of just asking for help and needing to call someone, but there was no vehicle to be found in any of the parking lots, so that wasn't on the up and up at all. Anyway, I know he went to jail for what I think they said was menacing, destruction of property, resisting arrest, stuff like that. My bosses took over and were working with the police after I gave them my initial report. Working on your own at night can be really cool, but it can also have times like this that are pretty messed up. Angel on the Bus, submitted by Renee. My father was a bus driver, and on one run he had a man in front of the bus that had recently had a leg amputated because of diabetes. The man was loud, bitter, whiny, and suffered phantom pain in his leg that was no longer there. He was making everyone around him irritated and frustrated, and at one point he even said that he wished the old fucker upstairs would just stop his suffering. A few minutes after that comment, a man who was standing on top of the hill waved the bus down. He got on and bought a ticket and said that he lived along the highway about an hour away. My father had no idea how he got where he was. I mean, there was nothing around out there. The man sat next to the grumpy old man and said, "Hey, I know you." And the old man just replied, "Oh, bullshit. I've never seen you in my life." The man said, "No, you're right. You've never seen me, but I've seen you. I was watching you when I was hiding in your wife's closet, you know, when you came home early from work." The old grumpy man started to laugh. For the next 30 to 40 minutes, the man was cracking one joke after another, where he was telling the shenanigans they did as children. Then the man told my father he had to get off around the next curve. He looked at the old man and said, "Hey, your grandchildren need you. Take care." And then he got off the bus. As my father was about to drive off, the old man said, "Hey, he forgot his money." My father stopped the bus, grabbed a bunch of bills the man had left on the seat, and ran to catch the man to return his money. But when my father got off the bus, he couldn't see the man anywhere. There were no houses or driveways anywhere near where he had left the man, and there was just no trace of him. No one on the bus saw where he went, so my father just got back on the bus and handed the old man with his amputated leg the money. He said, "I think he left this for you." The old man just said, "How did he know I have grandchildren?" According to my father, the rest of the trip was real quiet. Barely a word was spoken by anybody. But the old man with the missing leg just sat there with a smile on his face. Hey gang, thanks for listening to this episode of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have a true scary story you would like me to narrate, please send it to Uncle Josh, truescarystories@gmail.com. I read them all. If you haven't heard your story yet, relax, it's coming. Please follow me on social media, all links to that are in the description below, and leave a like, share, and comment on this video. I appreciate it and will respond to you as quick as I can. If you want to take it a step further and support the channel, find me on Patreon. There's a link for that in the description below as well. Everyone, I don't know what your winter is like, but it is crazy up here in the Northeast. Yesterday we had snow and ice on the ground. Today it's 55 and all of it's gone. I'm not complaining. Much more to come, folks. Hang in there. And if you'll notice, I no longer have a website. I decided to get rid of that. It just wasn't doing anything for me and was kind of a pain in the ass to keep up and maintain. Anyway, everyone, until next time, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.